Alright guys, so this is going to be the last note video that you have to watch for the year. And so we are coming upon mini last. You will have one more set in animals, and that's going to be about animal behavior, but it's not one that we are going to be doing via a PowerPoint video. It's just going to be more like an activity. And so this is going to be it. I should be kind of coming around over the next couple of weeks. I plan on coming today actually. And hopefully I'll get a chance to talk to you soon. We have a lot coming up. I know you guys are busy. It's the spring semester. We're nearing May, and there's a lot going on. So let's just continue to finish strong. We are almost there. So this particular lesson, back in middle school and freshman year, we talked a lot about body systems. And so essentially what this lesson is this is about these essential functions. And if you kind of look at them, they definitely relate to our body systems. But essentially with Kingdom Animalia, there is a huge range of diversity. And so one of the things that I do not like about this lesson is I feel like I'm going to be saying these words over and over and over again. It feels very repetitive. But essentially we have animals from sponges, the simplest animals, all the way to humans, or complex mammals, which are going to be the most complex. And so how a sponge accomplishes these tasks is going to be very different from how we accomplish these tasks. And that's what this lesson is all about. It's the diversity in the systems that you'll find in animals to accomplish these essential functions, okay? So just bear with me. Like I said, it's not going to be super exciting. We definitely are probably familiar with how we accomplish these tasks. Like we are familiar with a digestive system, a respiratory system, a circulatory system, but not all animals are going to complete these tasks or accomplish these tasks in the same way. So your 7 essential functions are feeding and digestion. So we know that we need nutrients. We have circulation, which is going to be a transport thing. We have respiration for gases like oxygen. We have excretion to remove waste. We have movement and then support for that movement. Now, movement is not a characteristic of life, but most animals are going to be motile. And then organisms, of course, have to reproduce. Animals are primarily sexual reproducing. And then we have response, which is going to be our nervous system. And so we're going to start with the first essential function, and that's going to be digestion. And so we know that animals are heterotrophs, okay? They must get their food from another source. And now there's going to be a wide range of how they get that food, where they get that food from, whether they're herbivores or omnivores or carnivores. Typically animals are opportunistic in that they eat what's available, but there's all different types of feeding methods. So you could have suspension feeders, kind of like those sponges, where they just kind of filter out materials from the water. Substrate or deposit feeders. These are the ones that eat their way through a food source. So these could be some of like your parasitic type worms, could be substrate deposit feeders. Fluid feeders, these could also be some parasites, and that they're going to suck fluids from a host like a tick or a leech. And then you have like what we are, which is a bulk feeder, where they actually eat and consume large pieces of food. Now when it comes to digestion, these terms can be a little confusing for students, okay? So here we have intra and extracellular. And so if we just look at these words and what they mean, intracellular means within the cells, extracellular means outside of the cells. Now we know that our bodies are made up of cells, but when we're talking about digestion, what these are saying is either essentially each cell is responsible for its own digestion and getting nutrients, or we have a system or an organ or a specific location where that digestion is going to take place. So intracellular is going to be found in your less complex animals, the ones that are very simple and don't really have a lot of complex tissues. Instead, each cell is on their own. And so if we think about like us, I'm not doing digestion in the cells in my arm, and I'm not doing digestion in the cells in my brain. Okay, they're not digesting food for themselves. Instead, we have a digestive tract or cavity, or these digestive organs that are going to break that food down, and then we can absorb those nutrients and they can travel via the blood. So extracellular is definitely the more complex. They're going to have a digestive tract or a cavity. Now that tract can vary. It can be a single opening. where the stuff comes in and the waste go out, the same opening, or it could be like us where you have a tube, food goes in one end in the mouth, and then waste material comes out the other end. And this is probably the most common in most of your animals, even starting as early as some of those worms. Now there's some other features that you can find in order to aid with digestion. So we have like crops and stomachs. Now we of course have a stomach, but birds have crops, and these are going to be for food storage, some digestive function. Things like birds have gizzards. They don't have teeth, and so they use the gizzards to kind of grind. We have teeth. And we know that teeth can come in different shapes and sizes, depending on whether it's an herbivore or a carnivore or an omnivore. You have long intestines, and many times these intestines have those symbiotic bacteria. So they're long to kind of allow for the removal of nutrients and water and all of that absorption. And then they also have these mutualistic bacteria that help and aid in that digestion. There's some other things like jaws and the length of your digestive tract. If you're an herbivore and you eat plants, it's much more difficult to break down plant material like the cellulose, the fiber, and so herbivores have a much longer digestive system than a carnivore would, and so there's all different types of adaptations. All right, our next essential function is going to be circulation, and circulation is all about transport, and more transport. So remember that we're trying to transport things like nutrients and waste materials and water and hormones all throughout from cell to cell. Now, once again, we're going to start with simpler animals, and they don't really have a circulatory system. Instead, what they have is just a big cavity. So they have a giant area that kind of allows for these functions, and then the nutrients and the oxygen, they can just travel very short distances, and they just move by simple diffusion. Your more complex are going to have a circulatory system, which has at least 3 parts. We have the blood, we have the blood vessels, and we have the heart. Okay, now these can vary depending on what type of animal it is, but it is going to require some energy and pressure in order to move that blood around the animal body. Now when it comes to circulation and systems, there are 2 types. There's an open circulatory system, and what this means is the blood is not completely contained within the vessels. So if you look at the picture over here, here's that muscular pump. Notice the arrows, it's pumping the blood, and then what's going to happen is that blood is going to collect. Notice it's called a hemocoel. That's literally a blood cavity. So the blood just kind of is going to surround and bathe those organs in that main cavity, and then you'll just have some diffusion and movement that way. And then the blood can get picked back up and then kind of recirculated, but notice it's not staying in those vessels. It's mostly going to kind of gather in one big area where it kind of pools and bathes the organs. So there's really not a difference between the interstitial fluid and the blood. It's called hemolymph. And so what happens is that the body movements can kind of squeeze to help circulate it, but it's not really completely contained. Whereas in a closed circulatory system, the blood is staying in the vessels. Okay, the only time we have leakage is if we have an injury or some kind of damaged blood vessel. So we have the heart. Notice it's pumping. It's going to be contained in these capillaries, and then it's going to go back to the heart. Okay, so what we get are these loops. And so the heart is going to pump the blood. It's going to go from larger vessels into smaller vessels and then back into larger vessels. And the materials are just going to be exchanged within these small vessels called the capillaries. And the interstitial fluid is going to be separate from that blood itself. Now, when it comes to your closed circulatory systems, we've got different types of vessels. We have arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries always carry the blood away from the heart, and veins always carry it back to the heart. So arteries are away, veins are returning. Now, because the arteries are getting most of the pressure, they're going to have thicker walls, and they're going to be a little bit stronger. They're going to be able to withstand higher pressure, whereas those veins are a little bit more passive. A lot of times they do have some valves because we will always want blood going in one direction. And so what happens is these arteries branch down into arterioles. The arterioles become capillaries, and capillaries are just very, very thin. This is where all of the diffusion and the gas exchange takes place, is in the capillaries. Then capillaries will become venules, and then venules will become veins, and then back to the heart. The heart itself is divided into chambers. So depending on the type of animal that it is, there's differences in numbers of chambers. When we're looking at vertebrates, you could have a 2-chambered heart. You'll find that in a fish. You could find a 3-chambered heart. You would find that in amphibians and most reptiles. And then you could have a 4-chambered heart like you find in crocodilians, birds, and mammals. And so depending on the number of chambers of heart in the heart, we could either get single loop circulation or we could get double loop. So remember, the heart is going to pump blood, it's going to go pick up oxygen, and it's going to have to come back to the heart. Now, the atria are going to be the upper, smaller chambers, and the blood is always coming into the atria, either from the lungs or from the body. And then the ventricles are the ones that are pumping the blood away from the heart. And so in a single loop, especially if you have a 2-chambered heart here, that's when you will see that single loop. But essentially what's happening is the blood is going to go from the heart to the respiratory organs. In most cases, that's probably going to be gills. It's going to pick up the oxygen. It's going to pass through the body and deliver that oxygen, and then it's going to return to that heart deoxygenated. Now, when it comes to double loop, we have 2 circuits. Okay, we have what's called the pulmonary circuit, and this is where the blood is going to get pumped from the heart to the lungs to pick up oxygen, and then it's going to come back to the heart. And then we have the systemic circuit, where it's going to get pumped down to the rest of the body and upward to the rest of the body, and then it's going to come back. So the key to double loop is you have pretty much a lung circuit where it's picking up oxygen and returning, and then we have a body circuit where it's delivering that oxygen and returning. And so you will find a double loop with a 3- and 4-chambered heart. So here's like what it looks like in a fish. Okay, notice you have the atrium and the ventricle. So the ventricle would pump the blood, it would pick up oxygen, it would deliver that oxygen, and then it's coming back to the heart. Okay, so notice there's just one circuit there. In a 3-chambered heart, I want you to notice that here it's kind of purple because we have a mixing of blood. There's only one ventricle, whereas in a 4-chambered heart, the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood are kept separate. And so what happens is we have a pumping to the lungs to pick up oxygen, it returns to the heart, then it goes to the body and back to the heart. Okay, and that's what you'll see with both a 3- and 4-chambered heart. All right, with respiration, it's all about gas exchange. It's all about getting that oxygen and removing that carbon dioxide. Now, regardless of what type of structures the animal has, there are certain characteristics that you will find for those respiratory surfaces. Whether it be lungs or gills or simply skin, they're usually going to have to be bathed in fluids. They're going to have to be moist. They're normally going to have a very large surface area to volume ratio. And so normally what happens is you normally have foldings or layers or branches, okay? Because anytime you have extensions or foldings or branches, you're going to increase the surface area for things to interact. And then there's a very close association with that circulatory system. The blood is going to have to pick up that oxygen and drop off that carbon dioxide. And so some of the common characteristics or some of the common structures that you'll find in animals is you could find gills, which are kind of these foldings that are outside of the body. And so they are kind of exposed to water. You'll see this like in some of your aquatic animals. As the water flows over the gills, the blood picks up oxygen from the water, okay? And then you have tracheal systems like you'll see in some of your insects. They have these air tubes that open up to the outside of the body, and they allow for air to come in and into the tracheal walls. And then commonly on your terrestrial animals, you will have lungs. So like your more complex animals, like amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals are all going to have lungs. And these are going to be just these very much branched type of system here. We have these air tubes that branch down into these little tiny alveoli. And so the air comes in and it branches down into the lungs. It goes through the throat area, which is the pharynx. The larynx is the voice box. It goes through the windpipe, which is the trachea here. Then it branches into the bronchi. It goes down into these smaller tubes. This is all for increasing surface area, so it branches down into bronchioles. And then it gets down into these little tiny alveoli, which are our air sacs, and that's where there's lots of capillaries for gas exchange. Now, in addition to this, we have other kind of adaptations, things like hairs and cilia and mucus, all to help keep debris and dust and particles out of our respiratory system. Another thing that you'll find in some animals are respiratory pigments, and what these pigments do is they help carry oxygen. So like in us, we have hemoglobin. This is what makes our blood red. In fact, our red blood cells pretty much squish out their nuclei and they fill up with hemoglobin, and it allows them to carry lots and lots of oxygen. Hemoglobin contains iron, which will bind 4 oxygens, and we have lots of hemoglobin inside of our blood cells. Some other animals have something called hemocyanin, which is kind of like a copper compound, and it binds to oxygen, and a lot of times this gives like their blood a different color. You know, sometimes when you see squished insects, they don't have red blood like we do. All right, our next major function is excretion, and excretion is all about waste removal. Now, I do kind of want to clarify in that, you know, we excrete many different waste products. We excrete things like carbon dioxide. We excrete things like nitrogenous waste in our urine. We also excrete solid waste. Now, what we're talking about with this is excretion of nitrogenous waste. So we're not talking about things like poop. That is just going to be an end result of digestion. What we're talking about here is cleaning our blood of these nitrogenous waste. And so we're kind of dealing with like the urinary system. And for animals, we naturally produce ammonia as a byproduct. So in just metabolic reactions, ammonia is produced, but ammonia is toxic to our cells. And so animals have to have some means of getting rid of that ammonia. Now, a lot of times your aquatic organisms just simply release it in the form of ammonia. They just release it into the water. And if you've ever had fish aquariums, this is one of the things you have to check for is the nitrogen content. You have to change their water or clean their water, because if the ammonia builds up too high in concentration, it can start killing off your fish, okay? Now, other animals are going to convert that ammonia to either uric acid or urea. They are a little bit less toxic, but it does require more energy to make those conversions. So like reptiles and birds, they convert that ammonia into uric acid. And this is why like bird poop or bird excrement is kind of pasty. It's kind of this crystally paste, not really a liquid necessarily like we have. So sometimes it comes out in a different form. And then urea is what we do. So we combine it with carbon dioxide in the liver, we produce urea, and then we excrete that in our urine. It's going to help us conserve water, and this is not nearly as toxic of a substance. But all animals have to have a way to kind of process this waste material known as ammonia. Now, in terms of excretory organs, your most complex are going to be the kidneys. You know, they're a very complex filtration system, but others are going to have these tube-like systems. You'll find protonephridia and flame cells like in your flatworms. In fact, this is maybe one of the things that you looked at in your platyhelminthes. You'll find metanephridia in some of your invertebrates, Malpighian tubules in some of your invertebrates. I have a picture on the next slide. So here you see like this ant, they have these little tubules that kind of filter out and they carry those waste materials away. Here you have the metanephridia. Once again, they're all tube-like structures for excreting waste. And the kidneys are super complex. They have all of these filtration units that help us conserve water and get rid of waste. All right, when it comes to movement, okay, once again, it's not a requirement for survival or for life to be able to move, but most animals are what we call motile. They are able to move freely from one place to another. However, some animals are sessile, which means they are not freely moving, they are attached to something. So things like your sea anemones or your sponges, they are sessile, okay? But for those that do move, they're going to have either some type of muscle or some type of muscle tissue, and they're going to have support for those structures in order to be able to move. So some of the types of support that you'll see are hydrostatic skeletons, which is like a water skeleton. This is where the body just fills up with water. We know that water can be pretty structured. It can be pretty heavy. Think about like a water balloon. It's not just completely willy-nilly. It does have some structure to it. And so some invertebrates will have these hydrostatic skeletons like a jellyfish. Exoskeleton, of course, is on the outside. This is made of chitin. This is that same substance that we saw in fungal cell walls. And so these exoskeletons, kind of like on an insect, when you step on them and they crunch, or like a lobster, okay, they have these harder outer skeletons. And then you have those like us that have the endoskeletons, where you have the internal bones or the internal supports. But you can't really move without support. All right, for reproduction, once again, most animals are sexually reproducing, and so that's going to include fertilization. So there are two different types. You could have external, and this is where the females lay the eggs, and then the males come by and distribute the sperm. This would be an example of kind of random mating, in that technically it's not necessarily a selection of a mate. Typically, this leads to a very large number of eggs and sperm and offspring. A lot of times not all of them are going to survive. So this is kind of like what frog eggs or fish eggs look like. They have to be in water, they have to be in moisture, but you can see that there's a whole lot of eggs and potential babies there. Now in internal fertilization, this is where it's going to require essentially sex, okay? Not all sexual reproduction requires sex, but internal fertilization does. And so the sperm has to be deposited into the female. You will see this with some of your, a lot of your land animals. Now, you do not get nearly as many gametes, nearly as many zygotes. And because they do allow for reproduction in dry environments, there's going to have to be some kind of protection. So either the babies are going to have to be carried in the female's body, or they're going to have to be in eggs or something along those lines. So this next little slide has to do with where does the baby get the nourishment and protection from. So we can put animals into one of three categories. We have oviparous, ovoviviparous, or viviparous. And so I want to start by looking at a couple of prefixes. Okay, so the first one is ovi or ovo. Okay, so notice we see ov here and ovo. So anytime you see ov or ovo, those are both prefixes that refer to egg. Okay, ov or ovo, they always refer to egg. So think about like ovaries. O is a common beginning letter for many of your egg type parts or structures. So if you see oviparous or ovoviviparous, we know that these are going to be organisms where the babies are going to develop within an egg. They're going to get nourishment from a yolk, okay? Now the other prefix that we have is vivi, V-I-V-I. Now this comes from like the prefix like viva, and if you're familiar with Spanish, viva means to live or life. And so essentially vivi is referring to a live birth, okay? So up here we just see oviparous. These are going to be your egg layers, and most of your animals are probably going to fit in this category. Birds are oviparous. Most of your reptiles are oviparous. Amphibians are oviparous. Fish, most of them are oviparous. Insects, oviparous, okay? So most of your animals are probably going to fit in this category here. Now, ovovivi has both of those prefixes, so we know that the baby's going to be deriving nourishment from the egg, but notice they're going to have live birth. Now, I would say this is probably the least common of the three. Only ones that I know that can do this is there are some shark species that are ovoviviparous, and there are some snake species that are ovoviviparous. So essentially the mom carries the eggs internally, they hatch internally, and then the babies are born live birth, okay? And then the last one is just vivi. So you can see that we don't have that egg prefix, and that's because the baby is not getting nourishment from the egg. Instead, it's getting nourishment directly from the mother. And so you're going to see this like with us, like placental mammals, or even your marsupials, okay? And so we are going to have live birth, but we're getting nourishment from mom instead of an egg. Now, eggs can vary. As we saw earlier, you can have aquatic eggs that are kind of jelly-like, or you could have amniotic eggs, which have the shells and the extra membranes. So like reptiles and birds both have these amniotic eggs. Technically, we're considered amniotes, even though we don't have lay eggs. You probably heard of amniotic fluid or the amniotic sac. And so really we have all these specialized membranes for gas exchange and nutrient absorption and things like that. And so one of the significant factors of amniotic eggs is that it allows for terrestrial living or life on land. Now you don't have to know all this. This isn't in your notes, okay? I just wanted to show you that when we talk about an amniotic egg, like a chicken here, or like I said, it could be a turtle egg or a snake egg, but they have all of these membranes. And so, you know, you don't have to know all of this material. You know, the yolk is full of nutrients. You have the albumin, which is that protein. But they have all of these membranes that are going to provide and help take care of that little embryo and nourish it, and waste removal and nutrient absorption. And so it's just kind of going to be a more protected type of reproduction. All right, and the last thing we're going to talk about is the nervous system or response. Now, your simplest animals, they don't have nervous tissue. Your sponges do not have specialized tissues. They were one of the only animals that do not have specialized tissues. And then as we move up, as you think about your lab, as you moved up like into the cnidarians, and these were like your jellyfish and your hydra. Your echinoderms were like your spiny skin sea stars. You start to have these very simple nerve nets or nerve rings. And then starting with the worms, we start to see cephalization. And once again, we saw this with bilateral symmetry. Cephal equals head, okay? So cephalization is the head formation where you have these nervous tissues kind of collected in one end of the body, and that's what's going to give rise to ganglia and brains, which is going to give rise to more complex responses. So here you just have basic nerve tissue that spans throughout the organism, whereas here you can see we have these collections in the head area, which is going to give more complex responses. Okay. So your worms and your arthropods, your earthworms, or your annelids and your arthropods, they have this ventral nerve cord, which is kind of like a basic spinal cord. And then for your vertebrates, we have a very complex nervous system with brains, and your brains have different regions that have specific functions. So the cerebrum is the big wrinkly part of your brain, and that's going to be your information processing, your decision making, your memories, your personality. All of that's going to be in your cerebrum. The cerebrum, you have all like the lobes, your frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. The cerebellum is the little ball at the base of your brain. It's kind of a motor coordination and balance. The brainstem controls a lot of your basic functions, things like breathing and heart rate, those things that you really don't have to think about. They kind of just take care of all of those automatic functions. Your optic, of course, is vision, and then you have olfactory structures which help you to smell. And so here's what it looks like in your vertebrates. You can see that fish, they do have all the different parts of the brain, but they're kind of smaller, not nearly as expansive as a mammal. And then you can see that this brain is becoming more and more complex, which is going to lead to more complex responses and reactions. And that is going to conclude our last and final PowerPoint video. So hopefully that wasn't too crazy for you. I know there was a lot of terminology, but for the most part, just a little bit of studying and vocab review, and you should be okay. You're going to have a work day the next class, and I would use that work day just to kind of catch up on anything that you need to in animals. You've got a study guide you can work on. You may have notes you need to finish. You could have labs that you need to work on, but I would use that work day effectively, because following the work day, you are going to have a quiz over all things animals that we have covered up to this point. So you had a set of notes on Kingdom Animalia, where we just kind of talked about what makes an animal an animal. You had the intro to animal structure and function, and then you have diversity in animal systems. So I would just kind of pay attention to those, use that day to study and finish up whatever you need to. This is going to be our last note quiz of the semester. And like I said, you're going to have a work day, and you're going to follow that with the quiz. And then we're going to be getting ready to wrap up the semester. I will see you guys soon, and I hope y'all have a great day.